domain are things that are either never been in copyright, or they are things that have expired. Their copyright term has expired. Remember, I talked earlier about the limited time that's mentioned in the Constitution. That limited time is covered in the copyright law. So the duration has a lot to do with this. And I quoted a little bit of Psalm 13 here, just to remind you the duration is important. Probably the best source for finding out if something has expired, and it's complicated, is Peter Hurdle's site at Cornell. And I've got the address here at the bottom, www.copyright.cornell.edu/resources/public domain. Or you can just look up Hurdle copyright duration in Google, and I'm sure you'll find it. It's quite heavily used. So I recommend that for keeping track of what might be in the public domain. So here's a quick rule of thumb for works published in the US. Anything published in 1922 or before in the United States is in public domain. Anything published between 1923 and 63 is potentially in copyright, but the Hathi Trust has learned in their work with this period that only about 50% of that work is actually still covered by copyright. The reason being that in these days, before the 77 law, you had two 28-year terms. And in order to get the advantage of that full 56-year period, you had to renew at the end of your first 28-year term. So things that were in copyright in this period and were not renewed fell into the public domain. And the Hathi Trust has shown that about 50% of all the works published in the US are in the public domain from this period. So the other part is from 1964 to 1977. This is when Congress was working on the revision of the copyright law. So unlike this tax law that we have now that seems to take about a week to finish, this law took over 10 years to finish. And they did it deliberately and they did it carefully. And during that period, anything that was copyrighted got an automatic term of 95 years. And then, once the copyright law, the new law, went into effect, anything that was newly created after 1977 or 1978 on was the life of the author plus 70 years. That's more complicated than it sounds, but it's an easy thing to remember, life plus 70. One of the reasons this was done is so that the US would fall into compliance with the Berne Convention, which we finally signed, I think, in the 1970s. The Berne Convention is an international copyright agreement that has this particular duration. So the more countries that follow the same rules, the easier it is to enforce copyright internationally. So let's look again at what the public domain contains. It contains works published before 1923 in the US. It also contains US government publications. The publications of the US government, which by the way is the largest publisher in the world, are considered public domain, and the government claims no copyright on them. However, there may be parts of these documents that could be copyrighted by other people and were used by the government with permission. Also, there are works dedicated to the public domain, and we'll talk about that in a minute because we now have more sophisticated ways of doing that, mainly something called Creative Commons. And that's what we'll talk about next, Creative Commons. So Creative Commons is a way of providing an automatic license or permission from the author or the owner of the copyright to the users of the copyright. So open access, open educational resources are usually licensed as Creative Commons. This was a scheme that was developed from the computer science folks who had open source materials going for a while before this actually came to being. Creative Commons allows you a certain amount of nuance in the way you can give this permission. You can simply say CC BY, or you can use my work in any way you like, as long as you say it's by me as the author. So that's a CC BY. There's also a CC 0 license, which is basically public domain. Do anything you want with it, I don't care. This is the CC 0. It doesn't show up here, but CC BY is the most common one. CC BY ND means no derivatives, so go ahead and use my work, but you may not make a song out of my poetry or a movie out of my short story or whatever. And there are several others, and you can mix and match these in many different ways. The Creative Commons site is a good place to go to get these. They also have the artwork, so you can actually use those symbols on websites that you may own. And then there's open access. And open access relies heavily, again, on Creative Commons. And basically, the best source I know for copyright in the Academy is this particular circular, Circular 21, of the Library of Congress's Copyright Office that governs, or that talks about the reproduction of copyrighted works by educators and librarians. And because this is a government publication, it is public domain, and you can get it from www.copyright.gov. And you can download it, you can print it, you can hand it out to your friends, you can turn it into a song, a movie, whatever you like, a musical.